Okay, hello everyone, and thank you for being here today with us for our next monthly seminar series. Today you'll be listening to Dr. Kristen Krause, who will be talking about the role of resilience in older adults living with HIV and AIDS. So with no further ado, I will hand directly over to her.
Hi everyone, thank you so much for having me today. Let me just make sure that I'm sharing everything here. All right, great. So again, thank you so much. I know that we are all spread out throughout the world, which is very exciting and in different time zones, but yeah, happy to be here. So I'm going to talk a little bit today about a lot of the work that has kind of encompassed my research portfolio over the last couple of years. So I'm going to present a little bit of background on kind of where we are currently with the overall state of the HIV epidemic, primarily here in the US, and talk a little bit about the role of resilience, specifically in those who are aging with HIV, and present a couple snippets of some analyses that I've done that are currently out in the world under review at this point in time, and happy to chat and answer questions at any point or at the end. So just to give a little bit of a brief background, I'm kind of starting at baseline just because I'm not totally sure where everyone's knowledge point on this is, but initial projections kind of suggested that it would take until 2025 for people over the age of 50 to constitute the majority of those living with HIV here in the US, but we actually hit that number in 2018. And so in many regards, this is a really great thing, because what this is saying is that people are actually aging with HIV and not living with long-term morbidity or even dying, as we used to see at the beginning of the epidemic and prior to the invention and the widespread implementation of antiretroviral treatment. And so with this aging population, there's many biopsychosocial health stressors that this aging population often faces. So taking together just living with HIV, the long-term impact of antiretroviral treatment, which is still being actively studied to this point in time, because we don't know what the long-term effects are. And there's many longitudinal cohort studies following folks over many years and decades at this point, but we're still trying to see what some of the outcomes of that will be. And then just the overall aging process. And there's been many schools of thought whether or not living with HIV attenuates the aging process or accelerates it in some regard. And so again, more to be seen, as this is actually the first generation to age with HIV. And especially from a public health perspective, which is the field that I come from, historically, often deficit-based models have really kind of dominated our approaches, especially when we think of people living with HIV. We often focus a bit too much on the things that people are doing wrong or inconsistent, whether that's not maintaining adherence to treatment, or not using condoms every time that people have sex, or not doing X, Y, and Z things. And so there's been a push, I would say, within the last really 10 to 15 years to kind of move towards this resilience and strengths-based approach, especially for this aging cohort of folks living with HIV. And so just, to provide another kind of visualization of the background, again, here in the United States, and I would say, very similar in what we would see in Australia and in the UK and other parts of Europe, just in terms of the historical trajectory of the HIV/AIDS epidemic. We see here between 1993 and actually 1995, when antiretroviral treatment was introduced and widely implemented. And so then we started to see the shift in the number of people who are actually dying from HIV or AIDS, and people who are actually living. And so we actually see this shift here in the trajectory. And so a lot of researchers are kind of use this 1995 point as the demarcation between pre-art and those who are long-term survivors, and the post-art of folks who might have been, diagnosed around that time but had access to treatment and therapy options upon diagnosis. And so this is just another, again, visual representation, again, situated here in the United States. And I apologize, I live right by a hospital, so if you hear the ambulances, I'm sorry. So we see here, towards the right-hand side of this chart, where visually we can actually see that the majority of, we're starting to get to the majority point of people living with HIV being over the age of 50. And these numbers will just continue to rise over time as well. And so there's many different ways that we could look at this, but just a few points to consider. That compared to everyone living with HIV, those who are over the age of 55 tend to have higher rates of viral suppression, which, in this situation is a very good thing. For every 100 people, 71 have received some type of HIV care. And, in the HIV world, we often kind of think of this as the care continuum where, we want folks not only to be receiving care, but we want them to be retained in care. And then with that retainment in care to achieve viral suppression. And so the other kind of, complicating part here is that historically we probably in a lot of the work that you all do, we may not actually think of 50 or even 55 as demarcating an older adult or an aging perspective. It's, I think, in a lot of the work that a lot of people do, it's considered midlife. But again, when we contextualize the history of the HIV epidemic, when people weren't living past their 30s and 40s, getting to this age 50 was actually a really, prominent deal, which is why it's kind of where we situate the aging work. So as I also kind of alluded to, we've had a lot of biomedical advances at this point in time. So, obviously antiretroviral treatment is a key point of that. But then there's also, pre-exposure prophylaxis and post-exposure prophylaxis where people can take a certain regimen prior to, if there's engaging in potentially high risk activity where HIV could be transmitted. If you're taking pre-exposure prophylaxis, the likelihood of you actually contracting HIV is almost 0%. And so a lot of this work is also situated in this undetectable, meaning untransmittable, but adherence to treatment, both for those who are HIV negative, if you're taking PEP or PrEP, and also those who are HIV positive, is really vital to the success of treatment as prevention being a movement that is really, I have to say, I'm a little bit more naive in terms of its rollout in other parts of the world. I know the UK has taken this approach, and I believe other parts of Australia and Europe, and we're getting there in a more global perspective. But we know that in any type of global work in developing countries, when it comes to patents and availability of medications, that there's often a lot of hurdles that folks have to jump through in order to receive treatment. And so when we think of aging with HIV, there's many complexities. It's absolutely fantastic that these folks are living much longer and fuller lives. However, there are additional challenges that have to be navigated and addressed. So things like heightened concerns around mental and neurocognitive health. There's a substantial body of literature that has examined neurocognitive functioning in association with HIV, especially those who are long-term survivors. So again, as I've alluded to, not totally understanding at this point in time what the long-term effects of antiretroviral treatment are. There's a substantial body of work looking at ongoing HIV-related trauma in the form of, AIDS survivor syndrome in some situations where There's, collective grief in some communities of, why did I make it, but my partner, my lover, my friends, my community members did not. And I think some of this in the time of COVID has been, anecdotally in conversations I've had, has been re-traumatizing for some people, especially with the COVID, protocols and kind of, I don't know if hoopla is the right word to say right now, but a lot of the messaging has been very similar to what folks had to navigate during the height of the epidemic, which I will come back to because I think that it's an important point to note that with this potential re-traumatization actually does come some aspects of resilience and the ability to overcome some of the re-traumatization. And there's a lot of stigma due to age, HIV status, race, ethnicity, when we start to think of some of the other, demographic factors that and identity-based things that people hold within themselves. And the other aspect of this too is fragmented and fragile networks. And I know last week when we did the podcast, we talked a little bit about this just from an aging perspective, where folks who are getting older tend to have ebbs and flows in their social networks anyways because of getting older and people dying. But when we think about this in the context of the gay community specifically, there was a lot of loss historically, and so there's already stigmatization around being a member of the LGBT community, which arguably has gotten a lot better in recent years. But at the height of the epidemic, not only were people navigating stigma around HIV and sexual orientation, this had a huge impact on family dynamics and familial relationships and things like that. And so, kind of moving in this perspective that, we think of older adults living with HIV, we can't just contextualize their care from a biomedical, physical perspective, which I think often dominates conversations, not all the time, but in some spaces it turns into a very medicalized approach. I know from my own network of people living with HIV, often, historically, doctor's visits were only looking at the very biomedical based outcomes and not really focusing on mental health or emotional well-being. And they've definitely moved in that direction, but historically we haven't really considered the whole person when we're navigating some of these challenges. And so kind of moving a little bit into the theoretical framework, I intentionally for this group didn't really provide all the definitions we may use of resilience, because I think of this group knows what I'm talking about. So I didn't want to waste slides, but when we started engaging with this work about, over the last 10 years at our research center, one of the theoretical frameworks that we kind of developed was that resilience could act as a buffer between negative biopsychosocial health outcomes and the relationship between those and, the synergistic effects of, the aging process in general, living with HIV long-term, and many of the psychosocial and structural states that I've already kind of highlighted throughout. So this was actually the theoretical framework that drove my dissertation research, which I, as I mentioned, is still actively under review. And so the study that we kind of created based off of this model was based on other historical work that my mentors and colleagues of mine at our research center had been doing for many years in the New York City area. Aging with HIV has been something that, especially in a big metropolitan area like New York City, we are fortunate to be able to study in different ways because so many people live there and are accessible. And so the Gold 3 study was the third iteration of an aging with HIV portfolio of studies, if you will. The first one focused a lot more on just mental health, substance use, sexual behaviors in older gay men living with HIV. Goal 2 focused a lot more on neurocognitive outcomes between men and older men and women living with HIV. And so this particular study, we were intentional about a few things. The one thing that I kind of didn't highlight here, and I'm now realizing I'm missing a slide. This is the slide I'm missing. So to take a step back real quick, one of the things when we think about resilience within this group specifically is the importance of acknowledging sexual orientation and identity as a key element in people's lives. And so historically, a lot of the work that we've seen done specifically with HIV among, I'll say the LGBT community for now, but what I really mean is HIV among men who have sex with men, lumps anyone who might fall under the category of men who have sex with men together. And so there's really no teasing out the differences between trans women and gay men and bisexual men and straight men who just might engage in having sex with other men from time to time, but don't identify as a gay man. And so as someone who also does a substantial amount of LGBT related research, while it's really great to be an LGBT scholar and feel like we've got some stake in this game and we can actually say that LGBT health is a thing that we can study, part of that too is kind of pushing this narrative that not everyone under the LGBT umbrella has the same experience. And so one of the key things that we wanted to make sure we did with this particular study was to really examine resilience from the perspective of older HIV positive gay identified men. And so that was one of the inclusion criteria that we had. So folks had to be between the ages of 50 and 69, assigned male at birth, and then currently identify as male and gay at the time of screening, obviously be HIV positive. Because we were, there was many parts of the study, but we did not want neurocognitive functioning to be a potential confounder, mediator, moderator. So we wanted people to not have a history of traumatic brain injury. And if they did, to not have a loss of consciousness for more than 30 minutes. And folks had to live in the New York City area. So our team, fortunately, has been very successful in recruiting participants. We, at the time that the study was done, we were at New York University. And so our research office was very centrally located, so it was very easy for folks to come. So between our community-based outreach, we did a lot of work on dating and sex apps on websites and phones. And again, being in New York City, not having a shortage of events. This data was all collected between 2016 and 2018. So obviously in a pre-COVID time when we could go out and do whatever we wanted and have the time of our lives. So this is just some samples of our recruitment materials. We would have these two images on the left are just like business card size that we would kind of go out into the world with. And so some of the key measures, like I said, we kind of came with this from a biopsychosocial perspective. So we did do like in terms of physical health, we did take blood pressure and, we did some CRP, ESR, cortisol assessments, which I'm not going to really highlight as much here, but some other measures of, self-reported health. And we did like a comorbidity index just to kind of assess physical health as well. But some relevant measures that I'm going to kind of highlight today. Some of the mental health things that we looked at were everything from PTSD to substance use, depression, anxiety, resilience. We included a few things. I'm going to talk about the bottom thing listed here, the HIV and resilience scale, because we actually wanted to create a more nuanced tool. I think many of us could probably engage in a debate for hours about measuring resilience. It's not as easy. I think some of us would like. I think we've often been engaged in the dynamic conversation of what is resilience? Is it a trait? Is it a process? Is it an outcome? Is it all of these things? And so what I will say about what you see here is my thoughts have shifted substantially over the last 6 years, really, since we created this measure. Just in terms of what I will acknowledge is that this is a very individualized approach to resilience. Again, we created it 5 years ago. So this is the point of learning and growing as a scholar, but this was a set of items that we created based on some other tools. So you'll see some items that are similar to some of the other, key resilience measurements that we have, to our access. But, in some of the work that I did leading up to my dissertation, it just became pretty clear that there wasn't a gold standard. And so, we just, when you're mentored by a psychometrician, this is what happens. You create new scales. And so these are just some of the sample demographics of the study. It was pretty, oh, the cat's here now to join us. It was pretty well represented with regard to race, ethnicity, and educational attainment. We purposely didn't use income as as how we were assessing financial situation, because I think all of us know that it could be a much more subjective thing. And so that's why we asked whether or not folks felt like they had enough money to live comfortably or not. In terms of some of our health indicators, the median year of diagnosis was 92. It was pretty well distributed in terms of folks who were diagnosed prior to the implementation of antiretroviral treatment, history of an AIDS diagnosis or opportunistic infection. The one thing that I always, like to point out is that for the most part, this particular sample was undetectable, so 82%, or had a viral load under 500, which is not undetectable, but is definitely trending in that direction. For the most part, people rated their health as either good, very good, or excellent. So, when we think of these self-reported measures, my computer is just going crazy. And so the first kind of analysis that I'll just present briefly is we wanted to look at the factor structure and psychometric properties of that HIV-related resilience scale that I just showed you. So these are just, some of the item response distributions. 3 of the items were reverse coded, so that's why you kind of see the switch here with these 3. What's happening? And so the results from the exploratory factor analysis showed that, not ideally, but we used M+ to do this, but the 3-factor solution was the best fit when we looked at the item distribution overall. And so the 3 kind of subscales that we came up with after looking at the distribution was the notion of adaptive coping, optimism, and effective coping. So we can see here kind of how these all trended together. And I apologize, I do not know what is happening with my computer right now. But when we looked at, convergent and discriminant validity, just to kind of, see, okay, we're assessing resilience, are things trending in how we would think in terms of, are they positively associated with other resilience scales? So we use the brief resilience scale and the grit scale, which I know grit is not the same as resilience, it's just a close construct. And so, across the board, the results were what we expected. Those who had higher resilience scores typically were correlated with other resilience scales. If you had a higher resilience, like HIV related resilience score, you tended to have a lower HIV related stigma, or gay related stigma score, less attachment, anxiety, and avoidance. And then things that we expected it to not be related to at all, when we looked at BMI and blood pressure, were not related at all. I'm happy to answer questions as to why those were the things after, but that's what happens when you write a study and you forget to include things that would not be related at all. And so we had to go with what we had. The reliability scores were pretty good for the scale overall. And so, from our preliminary findings, it's a psychometrically sound scale that can be used in research settings. it does need to be implemented in other populations and in other times. It was refined to the best of our ability, doing field testing ahead of time. And we did eliminate some items before coming up with the final 10. And so, but what we kind of wanted to do to take this a step further is to actually look at correlates of this newly defined HIV related resilience scale and look at the relationship between that and mental health. And so I'm not going to go through everything here because I know these are a lot of numbers, and for some of us it's a Thursday and we don't want to stare at numbers all day. But the things that I'll point out the most here are the perceived financial situation. The history of AIDS diagnosis is not as big of an indicator here, but when we looked at the mental health outcomes and associations with the HIV related resilience, what we saw across the board is that even in our multi-level models, that folks who had higher levels of resilience tended to have fewer instances of endorsing PTSD, suicidality, any of the mental health outcomes here. They also tended to be more financially secure. And so we can kind of see how this plays out here in the multivariate models. We looked at it via the full scale, but then also in these 3 subscales as well. And then we also wanted to look at whether or not HIV related resilience could potentially mediate HIV related stigma and the total number of mental health endorsements. And what we saw is basically that it did, limitedly, but it did. And so again, these were just some very basic models that we did just to kind of play with it a little bit and see how these things were all related to each other. And so, as I've mentioned, those with higher levels of HIV related resilience were more financially secure, had lower levels of PTSD, and that there was at least a moderate mediation relationship between HIV related stigma and mental health outcomes. And so some of the limitations from the study overall is that it was a cross-sectional design. So obviously we can't make any causal inferences. The findings, as much as many of us probably love New York City, it's not always the most generalizable to even other parts of the United States, and certainly not other parts of the world. And so there's a lot more resources for folks living in the New York City period, but also New York State has a pretty good HIV safety net program for folks living with HIV compared to many other states here in the US. I know folks who don't live in the US look at our healthcare system and are probably asking many questions and saying WTF over and over again, and we also are. But there's at least more support available for folks in the more urban areas than folks who are not living. And so to my third point here, it's not a totally representative sample of all gay men living with HIV, not only in the US, but throughout the world. And due to how do we implemented some of the questions, there is always a potential for interviewer and measurement bias. But with limitations does come some noteworthy strengths. It is an original data source, so it's not coming from, a secondary national sample of questions. And the fact that we were specifically looking at gay men for us in the context of the work that we did was particularly important, and we were able to attract a pretty socio-demographically diverse sample. Having the multiple measures of resilience included was important, not only to kind of validate our own measure, but we can also look at this work in other ways based on what's already been out in the literature. And the study overall was kind of able to help us lay the foundation to test this theory of resilience that up to this point in time we were not able to do because we didn't have the data before. So in terms of some of the future directions and implications, especially again, as a public health researcher, I am the first to say that public health historically, and even to this day, even in the time of COVID, does a really bad job of focusing on strengths-based approaches and resilience. When you look at resilience in public health, it's a significantly underutilized approach. There's some work being done, but it's definitely been in the last 2 years. It hasn't had the historical precedence that we could even say we see in social work and psychology for sure. I know I'm probably joined here by a lot of psychologists who know what I'm talking about. And so, these fields have been doing this work for decades. So there's a lot that public health can learn and can implement. Again, if we kind of contextualize this also in the time of COVID, especially here in the US, I can't totally speak for what's happening elsewhere, but we're really at a point where we haven't even, caught our breath yet. So to think that we can push this mold is definitely something I'm going to continue to work on, but COVID has really kind of put a wrench in, I think, a lot of our plans. But also kind of moving towards bridging the gap between the health of populations and individuals. Again, as a public health, researcher who is surrounded by a bunch of psychologists in the work that I do, it's really important to, understand that yes, public health and population approaches are very important, but that a lot of interventions and policies and programs and whatever are not always sufficient for all people. And so, looking at offerings and figuring out what can be tailored to individual groups or even individual communities is really important. And at least in the US, again, the services for older gay adults are very, very limited. There's an organization called SAGE, which is Services and Advocacy for GLBT Elders, that is one organization that helps bridge this gap, but on a policy level, on a programmatic level, on a community level, there's just not a lot available for folks who are aging and who identify as LGBT. And I know that there's been a lot of talks around various ending the HIV epidemic plans. I would argue, especially in developed countries, I know that the WHO has, a plan globally. But I think one of the key points that's often missing from this is actually including people living with HIV in these efforts. A lot of times there's a couple people at the table, but their voices have not been included overall. A lot of the focus is obviously on prevention, which is definitely important, but having those folks at the table is also equally important. And, a lot of, as I've kind of already alluded to with COVID, understanding what the impact is on both LGBT communities and people living with HIV. What lessons can we learn from history? How can we apply these lessons to future pandemics? How do we ensure that, care and access is equitable? One of the things that I've been saying in the work that we've done, so when COVID hit, as a group of HIV researchers, we were understandably very concerned of what the impact on COVID was going to be on people living with HIV. We put together a few grants and tried to get secure funding as soon as we could to kind of examine this. And I haven't presented the findings here, but I think one of the biggest takeaways from one of the clinic-based studies that we've done that basically showed that people who are connected with care, who are living with HIV, did not really have horrible outcomes. They had access to care. They were able to, still use telemedicine and connect with their providers. I think of our sample, only 5 to 7% tested positive for COVID, which again is similar to our national and international numbers, but that didn't have, obviously, if we interviewed them, they were still here. And so there's something to be said specifically about this group who are, whether they are definitely aging with HIV, who are members of the LGBT community. I think one of the things that when we kind of took a step back and realized, historically, this is a group that is used to heeding public health guidance, whether it was the closure of bathhouses, whether it's being told all the time to wear condoms and to practice safe sex, or practice safer methods of injecting drugs, whatever the case might be. Historically, this is a group that is quite frankly used to being told what to do by public health officials. And so when it comes to practicing social distancing and getting vaccinated and wearing a mask and quarantining and all of these things that we've been told over the last almost 2 years in the time of COVID, this is a group that actually, when we think about it, I'm not totally surprised that they're not having as adverse of health outcomes as we might have initially expected, because of that collective resilience. In a way, this is a community that's kind of come together and is able to support one another in different ways, because they've had to historically for the last 30 to 50 years. So this really, yes, when we talk about re-traumatization, is definitely a thing, but it's not, there's those elements of being able to bounce back and overcome, which I think is a core tenet to a lot of the work that all of us do. So just some quick acknowledgements. Of course, we wouldn't be able to do this without the whole team that we have at our research center, everyone from our interns to our research assistants, all of the community organizations who help us in our recruitment efforts. I've got many co-investigators and study collaborators across many different studies. And so always eternally grateful to them. And if anyone, I'm happy to answer questions now, but if anyone wants to be in touch, this is how you can do it. So sorry for going a couple minutes over.
No, that was great. Thank you, Kristen. Does anyone have any questions for Kristen? Please remember to unmute yourself. Yeah.
Yes, I have a question or two and an observation. First of all, thank you, Kristen. I think it's an interesting study, and I think it's important. I know you have to have mea culpas at the end of a talk, but I think that the strengths of the research far outweigh, the limits that actually almost all research studies have. So that's kind of an editorial comment to you. A couple of things. In one of your final slides on the path model, I think your resilience concept and HIV resilience measure was placed as a mediator, as I recall. And I wondered, as you've worked with the data, have you viewed it as in terms of more direct effects rather than indirect effects? I think oftentimes we take resilience measures and we stick them in the middle of a model, rather than sticking them at, let's just say, the left side of a model. And I was curious as to whether you and your team have kind of played around with that or considered that.
It's a really interesting thing, and I appreciate you bringing it, because I don't think we have. And in the sense of full disclosure, I defended my dissertation on March 12th of 2020, and the world shut down on March 13th. So there hasn't been as much playing with the data as I would have liked in this time, but we've got some other people who are coming in now. So I actually think it's an important thing to bring up, because you're right. I think a lot of time we do think of it as a buffer, but if we can even move it out before it becomes the buffer and just have it be the thing that drives progress from the beginning, and not have it be the thing that is in the middle of it, then it's an interesting way to think about it, and I appreciate that.
Could I make one or two more comments, Jennifer?
Yeah.
Okay. Years ago, like in 1928, Kristen, a guy named Ernest Burgess made this statement, which I think is powerful, and it applies to the kind of research design that you have. And he said, if situations are defined as real, they are real in their consequences. And so for those of us who ask people, what do you think about your life? And what sense are you making of it? And what meaning do you attach? I think that's powerful research. And I think that what Burgess said, that how we define where we are, that has enormous consequences for for how we what next steps we take in our lives, what choices we make about healthcare, as an example, how we view care and caregivers and all the rest. So I just wanted to point out that ancient reference to you. And then the final thing I wanted to say is that I don't know if you're familiar with Cutrona and Russell's measure called the social provision scale. It's been around for a while. As I recall, well, I'm not going to say that, I could be wrong, but it looks at six functions of relationships. And so it really breaks down in a finer way, I think, the various dimensions of how we intersect with people and what support they give to us. For example, they have one factor called the opportunity for nurturance. And their research and research of others show that those of us who have an opportunity to nurture others oftentimes are in far better shape in our own personal mental health lives. So I just wanted to mention that to you as well. So, but again, thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, that's incredibly helpful. Thank you so much, Jay. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Jay. Does anyone else have any questions for Kristen? I think your presentation was just that good, Kristen.
All good. There's a cat meowing in the background now anyways.
That only makes it better, I think. Yeah.
Jennifer, it may be that because Kristen does aging research, it may be that the aged person on today's cast may have more of an interest. Who knows?
I'm not going to speculate, especially because we're still recording. Okay, well, if there are no other,
We're all aging right now, so.
If there are no other questions for Kristen, then I'm going to say thank you very much for today and for your time. It was really interesting to hear about your research, and I look forward to working with you on future podcasts as well. So thank you everyone for being here. I hope you found this useful, and we'll see you all again next month.
Thank you. And thanks again, Jay.
Thank you.